Toquima Country, Nevada, 1887, the tail end of September. This is Silver Country, where the mountain underfoot is worth almost nothing, and the gray rock you pull out of it is worth a fortune or worth nothing at all, and out here the only law that has ever truly run is whose paper gets to say which. The stranger came up the canyon road on a black horse in the last week before the fall clean up, and near the mouth of the gulch he passed a little burying ground of maybe 40 graves fenced in leaning pickets, the newest stone cut, so fresh the dust had not yet grayed the letters. And above the graves along the whole east slope stood a hillside of dead windlasses and caved collars and gray. Abandoned headframes leaning against the sky, one for every man who had been told his hole in the ground was empty and had sold it cheap and walked away. He looked at that hillside of quit claims the way a man looks at something he has already seen in 100 other camps, because a worked-out mind that was never worked out wears the same face everywhere. And he did not have to be told what had been done here. He had ridden in the night before. He wore a brown felt hat pulled low, a patterned wool poncho gone soft and pale with dust, a blue neckerchief, and a gun belt with one worn Colt in it, the hammer resting on an empty chamber the way careful men carry. What happened here happened because a piece of ore comes out of the ground with no price written on it, and the man who owns the crucible gets to decide, in front of witnesses, what that rock is worth. No mine ever assayed itself poor in Toquima Country. A company did that, with a hot furnace and a cold ledger and a signed certificate on good paper. And then it bought the barren claim for the price of a mule and milled the very same rock at 100 ounces to the ton, and called the men it had robbed fools who had sold too soon. The camp at the bottom of the gulch was called Argenta, and it lived in the long shadow of one outfit, the Cordova Consolidated Milling and Reduction Company, whose mill stood at the head of the gulch and whose stamps ran day and night so that the whole canyon shook with a sound like a slow iron heart. The Cordova owned the mill, and it owned the only assay office in 40 miles, and it owned the store and the scrip the miners were paid in, and every autumn a few more small claims came onto its books cheap, with the water and the timber rights attached, because a claim assayed barren by the only assayer in the country sells for whatever the only buyer cares to pay. 3 weeks before, in a town far to the west, the stranger had read a printed circular tacked to the wall of a stage station, printed clean on good paper the way the important thefts always are. It announced, in the friendly language of a company doing a kindness, that the Cordova Assay Office would test the ore of any independent miner for a nominal fee, and that the Cordova stood ready to purchase, for cash on the barrel, any claim proven unproductive, so that no honest man need waste another season on dead rock. He read it once for the words, and once for the trick folded inside them, which was the little phrase proven unproductive, because he had learned long ago that when a man owns the furnace that proves it and the pocketbook that profits by it, every claim in the county turns out to be dead rock, right up until the day he owns it. Then he folded the circular into his saddlebag and turned the black horse east. No man in that country was ever cheated of his mine. Men merely sold, of their own free will, for cash, a claim a licensed assayer had proven worthless, and if it made another man rich a month later, well, that was mining. There were 3 powers in Argenta, and they all drew their wages from the same office. The company owned the mill, the store, and the assay furnace, and the furnace was the throne of the whole arrangement, because it decided what a man's whole life in the ground was worth. Merritt Sloan ran that furnace. 50, soft-handed, ink-stained, he was the Cordova assayer, and he could fire a cupel and read a silver bead as well as any man in the state, and for 11 years he had read them true for the company and false for everyone else, writing 2 ounces to the ton on a certificate for rock he knew ran 140. Because a man who can lie precisely is worth more to a company than 10 men who can only steal. There was Bill Sorrell, 33, the company claim agent, who wore a gun and a smile and did the part of the work the furnace could not, which was to visit a stubborn miner at night and explain the several ways a man alone on a mountain can come to grief, and Sorel had explained it to a good many, and 3 had signed the next morning, and 1 had not signed at all, and had gone down a shaft. He knew like his own hand, and never come up. Over both of them stood Dorm Embry, 47, the mill superintendent, heavy and tired, and not a cruel man, who read the company's own assay ledger before he read his morning mail and believed every figure in it because the figures were his, and who had written twice to the head office that the district was played out, and the head office had written back that other superintendents brought in richer cleanups from worse ground, and Dorm Embry, who was not a monster, had gone on believing the mountain was empty while his own assayer sat 40 feet away and burned the truth off every miner's ore before it could reach a court. And there was an honest man in it, which is always where the real damage lives. Asa Wick was the county mineral recorder, 54, and for 11 years he had written into a leather book every claim that changed hands in the district, and beside each sale, in his own careful hand, 1,100 times, the reason was proven unproductive per Cordova assay. He believed those certificates the way a man believes the sun comes up in the east. A number, he would have told you, burned out of the rock itself by a licensed assayer in broad daylight and signed and sealed, was the one thing in a lying world that could not lie. It had never once occurred to him that the furnace itself could be the thief. He recorded the lie in a fair hand and called it the record, and that was the most dangerous honesty in the whole camp. There was one more man who mattered, because he knew the one thing none of the others had troubled to learn. Old Hosea Pike was 62, and before the Cordova built its mill he had fired more cupels in the Comstock country than any man in Nevada, and he had run the Cordova's own assay furnace for a season until the day he watched Merritt Sloan doctor a flux and understood what he was watching. And quit, and now he shod horses and mended harness at the low end of Argenta and said nothing to anybody. But he knew the thing, and the thing was this: that a lie you write on a certificate can be written any way a man pleases, but a lie you put to a hot furnace comes back out of the crucible as a bead of pure metal you can set on a scale, and the fire does not care whose company you work for. The Gulch was not a ledger either. There was a young woman named Neva Cardwell, 25, who worked what was left of her father's claim, the Fair Chance, a narrow patch of deeded ground and one honest tunnel her father Josiah Cardwell had driven into the hard rock for 11 years. 9 months before, in the cold heart of the winter, Josiah had taken a sack of ore from a second claim he owned higher on the mountain, the Bright Water, to Merritt Sloan's furnace, and Sloan had handed him a certificate that said 1.5 ounces to the ton, not worth the freight, to the mill. And Josiah Cardwell, 60 and worn out and behind on his company's store account, had sold the Bright Water to the Cordova for $200 and the forgiveness of his debt, and a month later the Cordova ran that same ore through its own stamps at 90 ounces to the ton and pulled a small fortune out of a mountain a company had told him was empty. Josiah walked up to the mouth of the Bright Water one January morning to look at what had been his, and they found him there 2 days later, sitting against the rock, dead of no wound a man could name, unless a man will let you name a broken heart. Neva buried him beside the fresh stone at the mouth of the gulch, and kept the Fair Chance out of something harder than grief, and every man in Argenta knew it would be the next claim to come onto the Cordova's books. On the second morning the stranger rode up the gulch to the Fair Chance and found Neva Cardwell at the mouth of the tunnel breaking rock with a single jack, and he sat the black horse at the edge of her dump and told her the thing no one in Argenta would say out loud. "Your father," he said, "never owned a poor claim in his life. They fired his ore hot enough to read and cold enough to lie, and they wrote him a number, and the number is the only proof a man has out here, and they own the men who make the number." Neva set down her hammer and looked at him a long moment, and she did not cry, because she had done her crying in the cold heart of the winter and had none left. "I know," she said. "Everyone in this camp knows." Knowing didn't dig him out of the frost. No, he agreed. But knowing where the lie is written is a start on burning it out. Now, before the rest of this happens, you should understand that the swindle was real, even if the writer is not. In the mining West, a certificate of assay was not a slip of paper, it was a verdict. And out on the raw edge of the map, it was the only proof a man had of what he owned, because you cannot carry a mountain into court. The law said a claim was worth what it could produce, and the only way to prove what it could produce was to fire a sample of the ore. And firing ore is a skilled and secret business done behind a closed door in a hot little room, and whoever owned that room owned the truth that came out of it. The great milling companies did not need to salt a claim or jump it at gunpoint if they owned the only furnace in the district. They could simply burn a rich man's ore, write a poor man's number, and buy the ground for the price of the disappointment. None of this was hidden. It was done in a licensed office by a certified assayer who signed his name in daylight. The theft of a mountain was not a crime in that country. It was a transaction, proven by an expert, recorded by an honest man, audited by the very company it enriched, which is to say, audited by no one. And that was not a flaw in the arrangement. That was the arrangement. On the fifth day, the stranger did a thing that made no sense to anyone who watched it. He rode down to the Fairchance dump, filled 2 identical canvas sacks with ore from the same shovelfuls, tied and marked them both in front of Neva Cardwell and old Hosea Pike and 2 idle miners he had asked along on purpose. And then he carried 1 sack straight into Merritt Sloane's assay office and paid the nominal fee and asked, politely, for an honest test. Sloane weighed the sack, took the ore behind his door and fired it, and after a while came back out and handed the stranger a clean signed certificate that said 2 ounces to the ton. Poor rock, not worth milling. The stranger read it once, folded it, and thanked him, and put it away next to the second sealed sack of the very same ore which he had left in Hosea Pike's harness shed under the eyes of 3 witnesses, and he walked out into the daylight with the company's own signature on the lie. That was the whole of it. He had not come to Argenta to be fast, and he had not sacked that ore to sell it. He had come because the county court sat in Argenta only twice a year, and the fall session opened on the first Monday in October, 4 days off, and on that Monday the circuit judge would ride in and the Cordova would file its autumn purchases. The whole quiet apparatus of the theft standing in one room at 1 hour. Mabry and Sloane and Wick and the judge himself. And every claim the company meant to swallow that year would be recorded and made law before noon. The machine turned on a single hinge, the same as every machine the stranger had ever broken. Nobody in Argenta had ever thought to fire the same ore twice. That night old Hosea Pike came to the little tent the stranger kept at the low end of camp and stood in the door with his hat in his hands. "You had him fire that ore," the old man said, "and you kept the twin of it in my shed. You wanted the certificate." "I did," the stranger said. "Then you know what I know," Pike said. "And I have fired 10,000 cupels, and I will tell it to you once, and then I will go back to my harness, and I will not have told you." Merritt Sloane can write any number he pleases on a piece of paper, because paper takes ink like a liar takes a bribe, without a struggle. But an assay is not paper. An assay is fire. You crush the ore, and you flux it, and you fuse it in the furnace, and you pour it, and you set the button on a bone ash cupel, and you drive off the lead in the heat, and what is left is a bead of pure silver. And that bead weighs exactly what the mountain put into the rock, and not 1 grain more. And no ledger, and no company, and no signature on earth can argue with a bead of metal sitting on a balance in front of 40 men. Sloane fires the ore behind a shut door and shows you a paper. He has never once fired a man's ore in the open where the man could watch the bead come out of the cupel with his own eyes. Pike was quiet a moment. "I still have a furnace in my shed," he said, "that I fire for my own small work, and it will run an assay as true as the Cordovas, and truer, because I have no company. Your second sack is sitting beside it." A man who brought that sealed sack into the courthouse on Monday and fired it in the open on the courthouse steps in front of the judge and the recorder and the whole camp would have a bead of silver in his hand that the company's own certificate had already sworn did not exist. He set his hat back on his head. "But I am an old man with a forge and a lease," he said, "and I have told you nothing, and I am going home." And he went home. The stranger sat in the dark and understood the only plain fact he had come to Argenta to prove, which was that a thing fired in secret and a thing fired in the open give the same answer only when the man firing it has nothing to hide. Monday came up cold and bright, a hard blue October morning with frost still white in the shade of the mill. The circuit judge rode in at 8, a gray-tired man who had been lied to by better-dressed men than any in Argenta, and the recorder, Assayer, carried his heavy leather book across the frozen street to the courthouse. And the Cordova sent Dorm Mabry with a folder of certificates and Merritt Sloan to swear to them, and Bill Sorrell to stand at the back of the room with his gun and his smile, and half of Argenta crowded in behind them, because a court day was payday and spectacle both. Out on the courthouse steps, where no one had thought to look, old Hosea Pike had quietly set up a small brick assay furnace the night before, and beside it on a plank lay a crucible and a cupel and a pair of balance scales and a second sealed sack of fair chance ore and a good bed of charcoal, only wanting a match. When the court opened, Dorm Mabry rose and began to file the company's autumn purchases, reading each claim and its price and its reason into the record, proven unproductive per Cordova assay, proven unproductive per Cordova assay. And when he came to the fair chance and named the Cordova's price of $100 for the claim of a dead man whose daughter had never agreed to sell, Neva Cardwell stood up at the back of the room. "Those were fired crooked," she said. "My father's ore and mine both." And Dorm Mabry did not even look up, because he had a certificate for every word of it signed by a licensed man, and the certificate was his. "Fire it again," the stranger said from the doorway, loud enough to carry over the whole cold room. "Mr. Wick, you have recorded 11 years of dead rock on Merritt Sloan's word and never once watched the fire yourself. There is a furnace lit on the steps behind me and a sealed sack of the fair chance ore that this office assayed at 2 ounces 4 days ago, with the certificate to prove the number. Come and watch me fire the twin of it in the open, and record what comes out of the cupel with your own eyes." Something in the way he said it stopped the court, and the judge said he would see the thing done, and the whole room came out onto the steps into the hard bright morning. Hosea Pike fired his furnace, and the stranger broke the seal on the sack in front of 40 witnesses. And Merritt Sloan went the color of tallow and said it was a trick, that the sample had been salted, and the stranger handed the sealed sack to the judge to inspect the knots and the mark, which were Sloan's own from the office weighing, and Sloan had no more to say. They crushed the ore and fluxed it and fused it, and when it was poured and the lead driven off on the cupel, old Pike lifted out the cupel with the tongs, and there, sitting bright and round and undeniable in the gray bone ash, was a bead of pure silver the size of a pea, and he set it steaming on the balance and read the weight off the beam. 138 ounces to the ton. The stranger held up the Cordova certificate beside the bead. 2 ounces, it said, in Merritt Sloan's fair hand, signed and sealed 4 days ago off the very same shovel of rock. Asa Wick looked at the bead of silver on the scale, and then at his own leather book lying open on the plank. 11 years of proven unproductive per Cordova assay in his own careful writing, and something went out of his face that a man does not get back. Then, because he had been a fair recorder before he was a fool, he did the thing no man in that office had done in 11 years. He took the folder of the company's other certificates out of Dorm Mabry's hands and called for Hosea Pike to fire 2 more of the season's dead claims from the ore the miners still had, and both beads came out of the cupel bright and fat and heavy. And both told the same white truth on the balance beam. Poor rock on the paper, and a fortune in the fire. "Mr. Mabry," said Asa Wick, in the flat, sick voice of an honest man doing the worst arithmetic of his life in the open, whose mountain have I been recording? And Dorm Mabry, who was not a monster and did not become one that morning, who had believed his own assay ledger for 3 seasons because the ledger was his, looked at the row of bright beads cooling on the plank, and understood in one long second that the played-out district he had apologized to the head office for had been the richest silver in Nevada all along, and that the poor rock he had bought for the price of a mule had been milled at his own stamps into the fortune he could not account for, and that the men he had thought too honest to rob him had been the men he was robbing, and he reached, out of nothing but instinct, for the stranger who had lit the furnace. He did not reach for a gun. Dorm Mabry had never in his life needed to hold a gun. He said, "Take him," and Bill Sorrell drew from the back of the crowd, smooth and smiling, and leveled his pistol at the stranger's back across the steps and thumbed the hammer. But a company gun learns to draw fast and never learns to look, and Sorrell had spent 9 months telling frightened men how the mountain could kill them, and had never once wondered how a stranger loads a Colt. Bang! It was the only shot fired at Argenta that morning, and it did not come from Sorrell. The stranger had turned inside the draw the way a man turns who has done this in 100 camps, and the single shot took the company gun out of Sorrell's hand and left it ringing on the frozen steps, and Sorrell stood staring at his empty, stinging fingers while 2 deputies the judge swore in on the spot took hold of his arms. The stranger did not point the Colt at Sorrell again, nor at Mabry. He pointed it, flat and level, at the row of silver beads shining on the plank. "You can rewrite the number," he said, and his voice went out over the steps in the cold. "You can write 2 ounces on 138 all day long, and an honest man will record it fair, and a court will make it law, and a father will believe it, and sell his mountain, and go sit down against the rock and die of it. But you cannot lie to the fire. Every sack of this ore will melt down to exactly what the mountain put in it, in front of any man who will light a furnace and watch the cupel, and there is not enough ink in San Francisco to argue with 1 bead of silver on a scale. Kill me, and the ore still melts true. That is the whole trick of it. I did not outshoot your company. I fired your rock in the open." The judge weighed a bead himself on Pike's balance, because he had been lied to by better-dressed men than these, and what the beam told him ended the Cordova's dead rock stories in the length of 1 reading. The stranger held Asa Wick's leather book out to him. "This was never the lie either," he said, not unkindly. "It wrote down exactly what the certificate said, in a fair hand, true to the paper. It just never once got to watch the fire. That is how they use an honest man. They do not ask you to write a lie. They only ask you never to fire the ore yourself. Here is what the fired ore bought, because you should have all of it, and not only the part that warms you." Bill Sorrell was tried in Argenta that winter for the miner who went down his own shaft and never came up, and it was a hard case to prove, because a man alone on a mountain can always be said to have fallen, and in the end they hanged him not for the murder, but for drawing on the steps in front of a judge, which is to say for the 1 killing he did not manage rather than the several he did, because a company gun is only ever as guilty as the company is weak the day he is tried. Dorm Mabry was tried in Carson City in the spring, and not for a single ruined man, because the territory had no crime for buying a poor man's mountain cheap with a crooked number. He was tried for filing false certificates of assay and defrauding the sellers of their ground, which is to say he was punished for the paperwork of the theft and not the theft, and he paid a fine the company covered out of 1 season's dividend and served not a day. Because taking a poor man's mountain by owning the meaning of a number has never once, in the history of that country, been the kind of stealing that sends a man to prison. Merritt Sloan lost his license and turned up 2 years later firing cupels for a company in another territory, because a man who can lie precisely with a furnace never wants for work. Asa Wick resigned the recorder's office the same week, went home to a small house and a small pension, and he sleeps well, and that may be the most frightening sentence in the whole account. Because the man who records the number always sleeps well, it is the man sitting dead against the rock who does not. Old Hosea Pike went back to his forge, and now he fires a quiet cupel of his own from every doubtful sack a miner brings him, on the sly, for nothing, and says nothing, and goes home. The county recorded the fair chance and the bright water true in Neva Cardwell's name, and the next autumn she milled her father's ore at an honest custom mill 2 counties west, and stood at the scale while a man with no company weighed a bead of her own silver at 91 ounces to the ton, and wrote her name to the return. And she did not cry, because she was still out of crying, but it was a different kind of not crying than before. Her father stayed dead, though. Dead is dead, and no bead of silver sits a man back up against the rock and puts the breath into him. And the Assayer law stayed exactly as it was written. Whoever owned the only furnace in a district still owned the truth that came out of it, and nobody in Carson City repealed a word of it, because it was never the law that got broken on those steps. It was only one sealed sack, fired in the open. The Cordova sold its Argenta holdings that winter to a larger syndicate out of San Francisco at a price that still turned a handsome profit after the fine, and the new syndicate did a wiser thing than lie behind a door. In a cold stone office on Montgomery Street, a syndicate director named Corliss Vane, a man who had never in his life smelled a cupel, and had learned that a man need not be cruel if he can arrange for the law itself to do his cruelty, read a clipping about a bead of silver fired on a courthouse steps in Nevada. He read it once, for the one useful thing in it. He did not care about a dead miner, or his daughter, or a stranger on a black horse. He found the single flaw the writer had found, which was that any man with a furnace could fire the ore a second time in the open and shame the first number, and he wrote one line to his lawyers in Carson City, instructing them to see that in the next territorial session the assay of the district's licensed company office be made the sole legal assay of record, so that a second firing on a courthouse steps, however true its bead, would carry no weight at law against the certificate of the official furnace. He fixed it, not the theft, the fire. Next spring, in some other gulch, the whole silver of a mountain will go to the company that owns the licensed furnace, in broad daylight, with a statute behind the number, and the men who dug it will sell their ground for the price of a mule and believe they got the best of a bad rock, because the theft will have been made legal before the ore was ever fired. That is what a man like that does with a writer like this one. He does not hunt him. He reads him, fixes the one flaw the writer found, and makes the next theft too lawful to melt. The stranger rode out of Argenta on a Thursday. Neva Cardwell walked the black horse down to the canyon road and tried to give back the little money he had left in her flour tin, and he closed her fingers over it and told her that a season of milling her own mountain under her own name cost more than she thought, and to spend it like it might be the only one. She asked him where he was going. Nowhere, he said. That is the whole trick of it. Behind him a gulch that had watched its silver walk down to the company mill, wearing another man's number every autumn, went back to its rock, and far to the west a man in a cold stone office turned a page with a clean, dry hand. The bounty on a man with no name and a black horse went up that month by $500, posted by nobody, and the Carson City paper ran 8 inches about a curious scene at an Argenta court day and never once printed the word stolen. He rode south, toward whatever was waiting on the road ahead. He was not happy. Men like him do not get happy. They only get a little further down the road and a little more alone at every gate. Before you go, I need one thing from you. Comment below. 3 words. Where are you from? The country, the city, the place you are listening from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to know who is out here on this road with me in the dark. This was the story of Argenta, a camp that lived under a company furnace and an outfit that owned the meaning of a number, and a stranger who could not be shot fast enough to keep him from firing one sealed sack in the open. Where does he ride from here? Comment below and help me decide. Subscribe so you do not miss the day he finally rides west, down to the cold stone office on Montgomery Street, and a clean, dry hand and the man who owns the meaning of every number. And one more thing. Tell me which one you believe truly holds a man in this country. The gun in the smiling hand, or the furnace that decides, behind a shut door, what your whole life in the ground was worth. Like this video if you believe the real enemy was never the fastest gun, but the crooked crucible, and the fair hand ledger, and the licensed number that gets to call a mountain empty while it robs the man who dug it. See you on the next road.